Okay, so continuing Monday's class, we're going to look now at archaeometry. Archaeometry is using scientific techniques to answer archaeological questions. So this is including mass spectrometry, we'll just mention, and some other scientific techniques. So one of the things it's used for, or one of the things that people think about most when they think about the use of archaeometry, is its use in order to authenticate art objects that have a dubious provenience. No one knows exactly where they came from. They don't know if it's authentic or not. So one of the most famous recent examples of this was the famous James ossuary. This is the burial box that was found in a collector's home. He announced it publicly. It was going to go on view, and the thing that made this burial box unique is it had an inscription on it that said, James, son of Joseph, brother of Yeshua, or Jesus. So there was some idea that maybe this was the burial box of the half-brother of Jesus, James. Um, again, it was not from an archaeological excavation. Some scholars thought that it was a hoax, and some people thought that the burial box itself was authentic, but that the inscription was added later. This is the collector Ode Golan. This is the burial box. It was a secondary burial box, so it was after all the flesh and tissue was gone from a person. Their bones would be placed in here in the tomb in Jerusalem. And you can see when they raided his house, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, they found it, see here, in his apartment. This is a geologist who was instructed to study the box, and what he did is he looked at the patina, this outside surface of the box, and he compared chemically the patina on the outside all over the box to the patina of the inscription. If this was authentic, if the inscription was added at the same time the box was made and then exposed to the environment, the patina should be the same. If the inscription was added later, then it should be different. And that's what he found. He found that material inside the inscription was chemically different than material on the outside of the box. So he claims that it was a forgery. Another biblical artifact from the same collector is this Yehoash tablet that's supposed to talk about repairs made to the temple. And many archaeologists, again, think this is a fake, and they're using this similar techniques, looking at the inside of the inscription compared to the outside surface. Okay, so archaeometry can actually answer many, many questions. The source of material, what's inside a vessel, as we're going to see, and also authenticating art objects. So sometimes you can analyze the paints of a painting and figure out, okay, these paints are, could not have been used at this time period that it's supposed to date from, therefore it's fake. But sometimes that's not exactly accurate. I remember going to a conference, guy got up and presented his research. He said, this is a medieval painting, yet there are traces, the paint on the surface where I scraped dates to a later time period, and the painting, it's a fake. And someone said, well, you can't actually say that because the surface of the painting might actually have been added later as they, through time, were trying to restore the painting or keep it in good condition, and the paint underneath might actually date to the time of the painting. So, and that's actually a very good point. You can't necessarily say it's a fake if you're only taking the surface paint off. This this particular painting is not the painting I was talking about, but this is one that was recently restored in Spain. A woman in Spain at this museum who had no conservation experience whatsoever, no experience really, decided that she would take it upon herself to restore this painting, and that's the job she did. And she actually wanted to get paid for it, but a lot of other people were actually pretty annoyed that it looks a little bit like a Picasso now instead of a Michelangelo. Okay, obsidian is a great source to analyze. Is a great material to analyze because if you look at obsidian sources, right? And this is showing different sources of obsidian, right? And you analyze them chemically in terms of trace elements, right? Like strontium, zirconium, titanium, iron. And then you plot these on a graph. Each obsidian source is fairly chemically distinct from each other. And it doesn't change because it's a stone. You can't change the proportions of these trace elements. So if you take artifacts from an archaeological site, you have a good chance of figuring out exactly where they came from, and then you can therefore reconstruct trade routes all over the world, where there's obsidian. So the Mediterranean, Mesoamerica, North America, right? So it's actually a very good substance to use because you get this nice discrimination. And this again is trace element analysis. You're looking at certain elements, zirconium, titanium, iron. These are elements, right? Things like water, carbon dioxide are compounds. This is looking at elements, right? The smallest building block of chemicals. Okay, and this is what was done. You could see on a whole host of different materials in Mesoamerica looking at Mayan trade. Right, so you can use different substances and different techniques on them to figure out the ancient trade routes. Okay, with pottery, it's a little tricky because pottery is changed as the original clay is then made into a pot. But one technique involves what we call petrography. This is where the pottery vessel is actually thin sliced, right? It's a thin sectioned. So this is a piece of a pottery vessel that is thin, mounted on a slide, and light could pass through it, right? And when you use a special microscope that uses different wavelengths of light, it's called a petrographic microscope. It uses different wavelengths. Uh, as you alternate the wavelengths, these minerals in the clay will actually show up as different colors. And so you can look at, let's say, the amount of quartz or basalt in a clay source, and then the amount of those minerals in a vessel, and try to link that pot back to that clay source. And again, this is petrography. You're looking at rock, rock. You're looking at the minerals within the clay to try to source a vessel back to the original clay source. And that again can help you learn about trade and things like that. All right, residues. So sometimes you have pottery vessels that have some dried out substance inside, and archaeologists want to figure out what's actually in there. Maybe they have early evidence of a substance. So they use something known as mass spectrometry. And mass spectrometry, essentially, instead of looking at elements, it's looking at compounds. So it breaks the residue down into different compounds, tells you what those compounds are, and then you can figure out, looking at the compounds inside, what sort of substance you have. So if you have hydrocarbons, you have some sort of petroleum substance. If you have traces of lactose, you probably have some sort of dairy product in there. Right? And this is, similar to the techniques that they use when they swipe your bag in the airport with a little piece of cloth and put it in a machine. It's looking for specific compounds. So, well, as you put the compound into the machine, or as you put the substance in the machine, it breaks it up into its constituent parts, and you get what's known as a spectra, right? And these are all the molecular weights of these compounds, right? And what you see is that it's increasing. The numbers are increasing, and the reason for that is the heavier the molecular weight, the longer it takes to evaporate. Right? And so what this is showing you is time of evaporation as it's breaking this residue into different compounds. Right? So you all know from experience that alcohol evaporates faster than water. That's because alcohol has a lower molecular weight than water. Right? And so once you get these weights, you can then, these weights are specific to certain compounds, and you can figure out what's inside of the vessel. And this is essentially how things are separated out by molecular weight. They're sent through this mass spectrometer, which has a very powerful magnetic field. Right? The heavier something is, the longer the path it's going to take. The lighter a compound is, it'll take a sharper turn along that bend. And so you have here a collector that can detect the molecular weight. So this is a vessel from the Maya area that was analyzed. When they looked at it, it had the name of the person, the elite, on it, and it also had a glyph that spelled out cacao. And cacao is actually chocolate, right? The cacao seeds, cacao plant actually comes from Mesoamerica, from Central America. And when they opened it up and they looked inside, there was residue. They analyzed it in the lab, and believe it or not, they found chocolate. Okay, and this is something that's done on things like dyes from Lebanon, ancient Phoenician purple dyes, and they've also used it on a range of other things. So, you can say, all right, this pot was used for that. That can help you with your analysis. Also, this is the early evidence of wine or dairy products or what have you. So, an archaeologist who has actually worked a lot on the archaeological and archaeometric study of ancient alcohol has done a lot of work in Iran and elsewhere, and he found vessels like such as these two vessels from Iran are the oldest wine jars ever discovered. They date to around 5400 BC, and he found specific chemicals inside like tartaric acid, calcium tartrate that come from grapes, yet also a resin as well, and so it's a pretty safe bet that there was wine stored in these vessels. He's also discovered the earliest evidence of beer, and he's used some of the chemical analysis to reconstruct these beers. And you could actually buy some of these reconstructed beers um, if you look for the Dogfish beer label. You can go to this website. They've actually reconstructed a number of beers. A beer from the tomb of King Midas. You can see King Midas's beer, an Etruscan beer, an Egyptian beer, a Chinese beer. They've done a whole host of these. Patrick McGovern looked at the residue inside these vessels of King Midas in his tomb and was able to realize or determine that it was a mixture of beer and wine together with some other fruit added, and they were able to reconstruct somewhat a beer that tasted like it. So, good use of research money. Okay, diet. Diet can be determined not just from looking at animal bones, but also from the bones of the people. You can analyze carbon and nitrogen in the bones and the different proportions of isotopes, of carbon isotopes, nitrogen isotopes, can actually give you a good idea of what that person ate if they're eating mainly terrestrial plants, seafood, animals, right? So for example, this is the scale carbon, this is the scale nitrogen. So if you analyze someone's bones, and this is talking about Western Europe from the Holocene, you can see this terrestrial ecosystem, and you can see more of a marine ecosystem. So you could take a whole host of bones from a site and figure out what the diet was like, and then compare it over time. And that's something that we'll actually talk a little bit more about next week as well. Right? Okay. Well, diet can tell you. With diet, you can look at changes through time. You can look at differences between rich and poor, and they also use this uh, similar technique, but looking at oxygen isotopes in bones, to look at that famous city of Teotihuacan that we talked about earlier. At Teotihuacan, there were individuals whose bones they analyzed. And the interesting thing about teeth and bones is that as you're drinking water, eating plants from a certain area, the isotopes from those plants are being absorbed in your body. And so you sort of bear the signature of that area. But once you reach adulthood, the chemistry of your teeth stops changing. You stop absorbing uh, basically new substances into your teeth. Right? They're permanently grown, but your bones continue to change as you're eating, or they continue to absorb the material from what you're eating. So when they looked at bones from Teotihuacan, what they noticed on some individuals is that their bones indicated that they had lived at Teotihuacan for a good part of their adult life. But when they looked at the teeth did not bear that signature, and actually showed that they were born somewhere else. They were born outside of Teotihuacan and then moved into Teotihuacan uh, during their adulthood and lived out the rest of their life at Teotihuacan. Okay, we looked a little bit at the Viking swords and how archaeometric analysis on percentage of slag and things like that can tell us a little bit about production. Um, Another interesting case was done on the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell was brought over from England. It cracked. She was recast in the United States, or the colonies at that point, and then cracked again, and she was just repaired and left this way. What they did is they took samples of the copper or the bronze from the Liberty Bell, right? And what they noticed is that the different samples were different chemically. It was not uniform, it was not homogeneous. And what they realized, what was going on here, is that the Liberty Bell was not cast all at one time with one crucible. They didn't have a large enough crucible to hold all the bronze to recast this bell. And so they had to melt bronze, pour it in, melt more bronze, pour it in, melt more bronze, pour it in. And so the proportions of tin and carbon and other things were slightly different in different parts of the Liberty Bell. So that's, again, something the archaeometry told us about the Liberty Bell that we ordinarily would not know. DNA analysis has become very, very important. So looking at migration patterns, modern populations, ancient populations, it's very, very useful. And so places like National Geographic and other places have built up databases of full genetic codes for ancient remains and then modern populations. And so through National Geographic and other websites, you can actually submit your DNA, and they can give you a pretty rough estimate of where your ancestors come from up until about 10,000 years ago, sometimes a little later as well. And what sort of specific markers you might have either on your Y chromosome or your X chromosome. Those are typically the ones that are used. Sorry, not X chromosome, your Y chromosome or your mitochondrial DNA. Your Y chromosome obviously only comes from your father. Males only have it. Mitochondrial DNA only comes from your mother's line. And these are chromosomes that have fewer mutations. There's less crossover and less mixing, so they're a little bit easier to analyze in terms of showing continuity with populations. So this has become a very useful technique. And I actually submitted my DNA to National Geographic, and there's other websites you can do this. 23andMe is another one, I think. Paid a fee, about $100, and they sent me back the results, and they said I had a haplogroup J2, descendant of a Middle Eastern clan, and you could see descendants of this man played a crucial role in modern human development. They pioneered the first Neolithic revolution, the point at which humans changed from nomadic hunters and gatherers to agriculturalists. Right, so basically my ancestors created agriculture, so you can thank me later. Right. They've also used DNA analysis on things such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls were these almost complete copies of the Bible, the Old Testament, as well as other books hidden in caves in the Dead Sea area. And one of the debates has been, were these scrolls brought from different areas of ancient Judah and brought to these caves for safekeeping, or were they written down by one group of people who lived in this area who used these caves as a library? What they did is, since these scrolls are written on animal parchment, they looked at the DNA within the animal parchment. And what they hypothesized that if these scrolls were brought from different areas of Judah, then the DNA would be very different, because you would have animals from one flock and animals from another flock and animals from another flock brought to one location. If the DNA was pretty similar, if it looked like it came from one flock, then it probably came from one group that was local, and that's actually what they found. So most archaeologists think that these scrolls were written by one group of people who lived possibly in this area and then kept the scrolls hidden in these caves rather than scrolls coming from all over Judah and hidden here before the Romans attacked. Okay. So that's essentially archaeometry. And what we'll talk about on Wednesday, we're going to start getting into forensic anthropology, mortuary studies, right, and bioarchaeology. And we'll actually get to do a little lab based on that as well. Okay, well, I will see you on Wednesday.